So in this unit, we are going to look at nutrition, and it's kind of a review of the organic molecules unit that we did in the very beginning. We'll talk a little bit more about carbohydrates. If you remember, carbohydrates get their name because they're made from carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, and they're first on the list because they are the least complex of the organic molecules that we've discussed. And then we'll move into fats, which are also made from carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. But remember, structure determines function, so they're rearranged a little bit differently, which gives them different properties. And then we'll move into proteins, which is carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen. So they have a fourth ingredient, so you know that they're more complex. And then all of your life you've heard about vitamins and minerals. We're going to talk about the difference between them. And then we'll just do a little review of water. But when you guys were in elementary school, or at least I know when I was in elementary school, we talked about the food pyramid. And like the pyramid, the base is always bigger than the top. So the foods at the bottom you're supposed to have more of than the foods at the top. But it actually never really made sense to me because when I sit down at my table, I'm not looking at a pyramid. I'm looking at a plate and forks. And so it really makes sense that it has been changed to what we now call the food plate. And as you can see in this picture, it gives you an idea of when you sit down at the table, what your plate should look like with the 5 food groups: fruits, vegetables, grains, proteins, and dairy. And if you remember, a fruit is a ripened ovary. Basically, when you eat fruits, you're eating the ovaries of a plant. And it's the whole purpose of the fruit is to protect the seeds that are on the inside. And vegetables are basically anything that's a root, a stem, or a leaf. So if something has a seed in it, it's a fruit. So cucumbers are fruits, bananas are fruits, squash is a fruit, pumpkins are fruits. If you're a root, stem, or leaf, like carrots, onions, lettuce, broccoli, you're a vegetable. And grains are also plant products. So if you'll notice, 75% of what you're supposed to eat at every meal is a plant product. And the reason for that is we need the carbohydrates. Carbohydrates are not made by animals. Carbohydrates are made from plants, and we need those carbohydrates. Proteins are what you think of as meats, and then of course you have your dairy, your eggs, your cheese, and things like that. Now, just as a review of carbohydrates, like we mentioned before, that with carbs, they get their name because they're made from carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. And if you remember, carbohydrates are made due to photosynthesis. Well, when we talk about carbohydrates, these are the least complex. Plants make them. They're real easy for our body to break down. So they give us a really fast source of energy. But when we look at it from a nutrition point of view, just some foods that we eat that have carbs in them are things like breads, pasta, corn, and yes, cakes and sodas are not things that you should, eat a lot of, but we do eat them and they do have carbs in them. And since carbs are such a fast source of energy, this is why a lot of short distance runners eat pastas and breads and things like that before their races. Now, also, if you remember, we divide carbohydrates into simple and complex. Remember, simple sugars are things like monosaccharides, which are glucose, fructose, and galactose. And then your disaccharides, things like sucrose, maltose, and lactose. And monosaccharides, remember, were just one Lego. It's just one Lego. It's the most basic sugar you can have. You can't take that Lego apart. And then disaccharides, if you remember, form when 2 sugars come together. And then remember, anything that's a polysaccharide, which is 3 or more sugars that have been chemically combined, give you your complex sugars, which are your things like your starches. And if you're looking at your food plate, things that fall into these food groups would be obviously fruits, grains, and vegetables. So carbohydrates are made by plants. So any food that's a plant product is going to have carbohydrates in them. And the reason we need carbohydrates, again, they are not complex. They don't have a lot of bonds. So our bodies break them down incredibly fast. As soon as you put carbohydrates into your mouth, your saliva immediately starts to break them down. And so it's a fast source of energy. So that's why if you eat something like a Hershey's bar, which is just pure carbs, within like 30 minutes, you're hungry again. But if you eat something like a Snickers, which has proteins in them, peanuts, proteins are third on the complexity list, so it takes our bodies longer to break them down. So therefore, yeah, you're going to stay full longer. And since carbohydrates are plant products, one type of carbohydrate is what you guys call as fiber, which is cellulose. If you remember, cellulose is what makes up the cell walls of plants. It's basically like the skeletal system of plants. And in the case of fibers, our immune system, our intestines are highly folded. And it's very possible for stuff to get stuck in those folds. If you think of your intestines as your hair, you have to wash your hair because things get trapped in your hair. Well, things can get trapped in the folds of your intestines. And since our bodies cannot digest cellulose, it uses cellulose as a broom. You've all eaten celery before. You know that celery has these long strings that you just chew and chew and chew, and they just don't seem to go away. And that's because that's almost pure cellulose. Well, our bodies use that as a broom to help sweep out our intestines so food doesn't get stuck in there and start to rot, because that can cause our intestines to swell and tear, and it can lead to a very painful death. Okay? And just some good sources of carbohydrates are things like bran, which is in cereals, beans, lettuce, basically anything, broccoli, Brussels sprouts, pretty much plant products. Now, that then leads us to fats. And fats are your lipids. And if you remember, lipids are also carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. And we talked about how nature plays a dirty trick on us because nature wants us to be fat. Nature wants our bodies to have lipids. Because if you remember, fats keep us warm, fats help as an excellent source of energy, fats help our bodies protect our organs. And so nature wants us to have fat on us. Remember, fat's also what makes up our cell membrane. And since fats are nonpolar, they can't dissolve in water. That keeps us from dissolving. And so when we look at foods, when we talk about fats, remember we have saturated fats, which are made by animals. So things like butter, lard, they're solid at room temperature. And then we have unsaturated fats, which are your oils, which are made by plants. So things like olive oil, peanut oil, cornflower oil, cornflower seed oil, all that stuff, sunflower seed oil. But when we look at our plate, obviously then we're going to find fats in dairy because butter and lard for some reason and eggs for some reason get counted with dairy. And then proteins. Nuts have a lot of fats in them. So when people are trying to lose weight, they have to be real careful with how many nuts they eat because they do have a lot of fat in them. And again, like we mentioned, it does serve for long-term energy storage. It helps our bodies form those cell membranes. If we didn't have that phospholipid bilayer in it, our cells would have dissolved. It does form hormones. Now, you've heard of hormones your entire lives, but hormones are the ways that cells talk to each other. For example, when your brain needs to talk to your body, it makes electricity. But remember, not everything has a brain. And so when cells need to talk to each other, like when your pancreas needs to talk to your liver, it secretes a hormone called insulin. Or, in plants, plants don't have brains, but their cells need to talk to each other. So they produce hormones called auxin or ethylene. And hormones are how cells communicate. Well, some hormones are made from proteins and some hormones are made from fats. And hormones that are made from fats are commonly called steroids. And we also use fat, remember, for insulation. And so we talked about how there's a primitive part of your body who doesn't really know when you're going to eat again, so it wants our bodies to store fat. And that's why it's real easy for us to gain weight, but it's really, really hard for us to lose weight. So again, just as a review, with fats, they are made from carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. They are a lot of hydrogen connected to a chain of carbons with very little oxygen. If you remember with carbs, they tend to be a 1 to 2 to 1 ratio, like C6H12O6. The amount of carbon and oxygen is about equal, with hydrogen being about double, and that's in carbs. But in the case of lipids, there's a lot of hydrogen, there's a lot of carbon, but there's not a lot of oxygen. Which then moves us to our third group, which are your proteins. And if you remember, with proteins, we still have carbon, we still have oxygen, we still have hydrogen, but now we have nitrogen. So if you have a fourth ingredient, that automatically lets you know that this is more complex. So it's going to be a little bit harder to make. It's going to have more bonds in it. And in the case of the nutrition, foods that have proteins in it, it's basically anything that's a meat. Okay, so chicken, beef. When you eat muscle, when you eat meat, you're eating the muscle of an animal, and muscle is made from proteins. And you'll learn later that these proteins are called actin, myosin. So muscles are full of proteins. And you guys know that proteins are what tell cells what to do. This is why genetics is so important, because DNA is a cookbook that contains genes. Those genes tell our bodies how to make proteins. Incredibly, incredibly important. But from a nutrition standpoint, places that we get proteins from: chicken, beans, nuts, eggs. And what we actually do is we don't use the chicken's proteins. We take their proteins and we break them down and we get the ingredients and we turn around and use them to make our own proteins. So obviously protein is a food group by itself, but dairy, because of the eggs, and then whole grains will also have it. But for our bodies, proteins obviously make up our muscles, but proteins also make up enzymes. Remember, anytime a word ends in ASE, that is an enzyme. And enzymes are the helpers that our bodies have. And we talked about that, if you remember, when we used the toothpicks. And structure determines function, so you can think of every enzyme as having different shaped hands. So it has to be able to hold on to something in order to allow that reaction to take place. So if the enzyme denatures, remember that means the enzyme falls apart, it changes its shape. So if it changes its shape, it can't hold on to what it would normally hold on to, and it would not be able to cause that reaction to take place. Antibodies are the weapons that we use to fight off bad guys. We talked about them in the immunity section. And when we look at antibodies, these are arrows that we use to shoot at things called pathogens. And pathogens is any disease-causing organism. And with these antibodies, we use these arrows to shoot at the bad guys, and they stick to the bad guys, and they'll cover the bad guys. And so therefore, the bad guys cannot attach to our cells and cause an infection. And I just talked about hormones. And like I said, some hormones are made from fats, things like steroids, testosterone, progesterone, estrogen. But some hormones are made from proteins, things like insulin, glucagon, and obviously it makes your muscles. Now, all of your life you've heard of vitamins and minerals. And I'm not going to ask you to know a whole bunch of types of vitamins or a whole bunch of types of minerals. You just need to make sure you understand the difference between the two. In the case of minerals, minerals are inorganic. Remember, if something contains carbon, it's organic. So if it doesn't contain carbon, it's inorganic. And if you look from this list, minerals are elements. Remember, elements have a certain address on the periodic table, and that address is based on how many protons they have. And so based on how many protons they have, that also determines how many neutrons they have, and that's going to give them a certain job. Well, your minerals are elements that our body needs, but these elements are able to work by themselves. They don't have to form chemical compounds, and we don't use them as an energy source. Now, a classic mineral is calcium, and all of your life you've been told that you need calcium to have strong bones. And in a way, that's true. We do need calcium for bone formation. Our bone has a lot of hollow areas in it, and we use that calcium to solidify those hollow areas. But in all honesty, the real reason that you need calcium is because in order for our muscles to work, they need calcium. So your bones actually feed your muscles calcium. And since you're constantly using your muscles, your bones are constantly feeding your muscles. That's why we constantly need to replenish that calcium by milk, other dairy products into our bones. So yes, you need calcium for strong bones because the calcium helps fill in the empty hollow spaces in our bones and makes our bones strong. But the real reason you need calcium is in order for our muscles to work correctly. And calcium's abbreviation is Ca. Potassium is abbreviated K, and potassium is a type of salt that we find in things like bananas, and potassium is needed for water balance and for nerve and muscle activity. Sodium and potassium go hand in hand. You usually don't have one without the other. So I can talk about sodium, which is Na, the same time I talk about potassium. And without sodium and potassium, our bodies are not able to create electricity. You've all heard that too much salt is bad for you, but you have to have some salt in your body. If you have too much salt, it can cause your cells to dehydrate, which is going to kill them. But without salt, your nerves cannot create electricity. So we have to have some salt in our bodies. And you guys all know when we sweat, sweat is salty. And so whenever you cramp due to overexertion, there's nothing wrong with your muscle. Remember, pain's your body's way of getting your attention. So when you sweat a lot or you're dehydrated and your brain realizes, oh my gosh, I don't have enough salt, your brain will tell your muscles to cramp, and that gets your attention. And usually when you're cramping, you've been working out or you've really been sweating, and so your body is causing those muscles to cramp. Well, when you cramp, you'll stop working out or you'll stop that activity, which means your body will cool down, so you'll stop sweating, so then you will stop losing salt in that water. At the same time, sodium and potassium are needed by our kidneys in order to make sure our kidneys create urine like they're supposed to. So they play a huge role in water balance. Depending on how much sodium and potassium is in our bloodstream, that helps our kidneys determine how much urine it needs to make. If we have too much salt in our blood, we will not create a lot of urine because we'll put that water back in our blood to keep our blood cells from drying out. If we have plenty of water in our body, and we don't have to worry about our cells drying out because we don't have a lot of sodium and potassium in our bloodstream, then our body is able to make the urine. And iron is needed to make hemoglobin. Hemo is the root word for blood, and globin means protein. So this is a protein that we find in our red blood cells. If you remember, our red blood cells are shaped like baskets because structure determines function, because our blood cells carry things around. Well, one of the things that our blood needs to do is to carry oxygen. And hemoglobin is a protein that allows our blood cells to do that. You've all tasted blood before. You know it has a metallic taste to it, and that's because it has iron in it. And if you think about it, when iron mixes with water, it rusts. So your blood is red. Your blood is always red because your blood is rusty. And like I said, sodium and potassium will go hand in hand. So whatever you wrote for potassium, you can just write for sodium as well. Same thing. Which then leads us to vitamins. A mineral is an element, your calcium, or your sodium, or your potassium. Vitamins are actually chemicals. Okay? So like vitamin D is a chemical. I don't know the chemical, you can look it up, but it's a chemical. And so these are organic. These do all contain carbon, and they often work with enzymes to help the enzymes do the jobs that they need to do. And we do need vitamins in small amounts for growth and metabolism. Now, you guys know there's lots and lots of vitamins out there. And this PowerPoint just picked 2 examples of vitamins, because what you really need to know is what does it mean to be fat soluble and what does it mean to be water soluble. And with vitamins, you're divided into one of those 2 groups. Okay? Something like vitamin D is fat soluble. What that means is anything that's fat soluble, your bodies can store, and it's stored in the fat of your body. So with vitamin D, this is a vitamin that our bodies are able to store. So therefore, you don't need to take vitamin D every day, for an example. Yes, we know that vitamin D is in milk, and vitamin D we can also get is also turned on by sunlight. But anything that's fat soluble, you don't have to have that vitamin in your diet theoretically every day. Now, it's good to have it in our diet because it's better to have it and not need it than need it and not have it. But if our bodies can store it, it's not something we have to have in our diet every day. If you're water soluble, such as folic acid, your body cannot store it. So if you don't use it, you lose it. So vitamins that are water soluble, you do need to have in your diet as much as possible. But with vitamin D, this is one that you've all heard of. You can go look on your milk container and you'll see it. Since it is fat soluble, it can be stored. And vitamin D helps our bones store that calcium for our muscles. Now, folic acid is water soluble, and folic acid plays a role in the making of our nervous system. So when females become pregnant or are trying to become pregnant, a lot of times their doctors will put them on prenatal vitamins. And one of those vitamins that they ask them to take is folic acid. Folic acid is found in fresh green leafy vegetables, which is not something a lot of us eat. You know, we don't get our vegetables straight from the farm. A lot of our vegetables are frozen or they're processed in a can, and folic acid can easily be destroyed. And so with folic acid, our nervous system is already working. Our nervous system is already formed. So as adults and teenagers, we don't need a lot of folic acid. So it's okay that it's water soluble, but in children who are forming embryos, fetuses, and newborns, it's very important for them to have folic acid so that their nerves can form like they're supposed to. Which then leads us to a review of water, which we have done. You guys know that water is H2O, so water is insoluble. So water is organic because water does not have carbon in it. H2O is our friend, as you know. It is polar because hydrogen is the weaker of the two, so oxygen tends to hog that shared electron. But you know, it is the most abundant substance in the body, anywhere between 45 to 75%. It does, as you can see, serve as a medium for chemical reactions. It dissolves most things, so it helps our bodies break things down. Water heats up, it helps keep us warm. However, we do have to constantly replace the water in our body because we do lose it. We lose about 2.5 liters. So if you think of a 2-liter bottle of soda, we lose about 2.5 of those every day just from things like urination, sweating, and breathing. Most people don't think about you lose water when you breathe, but hold your hand up to your mouth and breathe. You can feel that there is moisture on your hand. And then last but not least, you guys all know that healthy diets are important because it does decrease the likelihood of obesity, which can lead to heart disease, high blood pressure, and diabetes. And as teenagers, you guys really should, even though most of the time as you get older, oh, I don't need to go to the doctor, you really should have your yearly checkups, just simply to have a baseline of some type, just so you'll know what your normal blood pressure is, so you'll know what your normal temperature is. Are you gaining weight like you're supposed to? Or is your muscles growing like they're supposed to? And of course, having just your regular exercise.